there are a lot of interesting traditions. I think probably the weirdest tradition is an Easter. They build really long whips. They're not real whips like we think of out of leather and they move a lot. It's just like branches that they weave together and they put colored ribbon at the end. And the men go around and whip the women, and the women give them alcohol or chocolate in exchange for it. And so they'll go from house to house and whip the women, and then they get either drunker and drunker or more candy as they go. And it's a really bizarre tradition, but one of the women explained it, how it had roots in like a pagan celebration of spring and how it was supposed to represent fertility or something like that. Usually it's all in good fun, like people don't get really hurt, but I had a really hard time understanding that when I first got there. And I even, when Easter got close, I'd ask, what does Easter mean to you? And once I talked to a guy who had just come back from Ireland, but he was Czech, and he was like, you know, I used to think that was normal, and then I left, and I realized that that's a really weird tradition, and anyone else would look at that as being a really bad thing. I was like, yeah, it's probably true, but it's different, but it ended up being fun. Around Christmas, they don't have a Santa Claus. Well, they do. So a few days before Christmas, they have like a Santa Claus and a devil, and they go around and they like tell you if you've been good or bad, and they give you candy if you've been good, and the devil's supposed to put little kids in his bag if he hasn't been good and stuff like that. They call him Mikuláš, that's like Nicholas. But that's a few days before. Then on Christmas Eve, that's the big day for them, Christmas Eve, and it kind of lasts for 3 days. So you have Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and then the next day. The tradition is that baby Jesus comes and brings you your presents, and he leaves them by the window. And they eat carp, like fish, and potato salad for Christmas, which I was always like, that's a summer food, why do we eat that at Christmas? But it does, and carp has a lot of little tiny bones in it, so they say that there are stories of people choking on them every year, but people still eat carp. And so that was really cool. They'll melt lead and then they stick it in cold water, and the shape that it forms is supposed to predict what your year is going to be like. And they also cut an apple in half, and if the seeds are in a pattern of a star, then you're going to have good luck for the year. But if they're in the pattern of an X, then someone's going to die that year. But when you look at the bottom of the apple, you can kind of tell if it's going to be a star or an X, so people mostly just cheat on it. And they have ones where girls will throw their shoes, they'll have their backs facing the door, and they'll throw their shoe over their head. And if it's pointing towards the door, that means you're going to get married that year. And if it's not, then it's going to be a long time before you get married. So their food tends to be kind of heavier. It's good, but personally it's not stuff that I would want to eat all the time because it is heavy. So most of their dishes, like one really famous dish is called svíčková. They'll usually have these things called knedlíky. They're like little dumplings. They almost look like a spongy bread. And then they'll have a thing of meat and then just some sort of sauce that they pour all over it. And that's what a lot of them look like. A few of them will have like sauerkraut on top of that. It's good. They have other things that are the knedlíky, but it's more of a dessert where it's fruit stuffed inside of it. And they'll put either butter and powdered sugar on top of it or a kind of sauce on top of it. Those are really good too. They also have these really good things. It's like the substitute for French fries there. They have things called croquetti. It's made out of potatoes, but they're in little balls and they deep fry them. And so it's like soft in the inside but crispy on the outside. It's really good. So they have lots of good things there. The soda kofula that they have there, it's not very sweet. It's almost like a cola, but just not as sweet. I don't like it that much, but a lot of people really like that. Sugar cubes were invented there. Contact lenses were invented there. So they live in tiny apartments in the city, and then on weekends they go to a cottage that they have out in the open area, and they'll have like a garden there. Grocery stores are different because you have to bag all your stuff. Nobody bags them for you. And customer service is a little different because it's more like you as the customer need to respect me as the owner of the shop instead of I'll do whatever to make the customer happy. And there are trams that everybody rides out in the city, so you either ride that or a bus. And so those are pretty much everywhere. And sometimes it feels like the tram drivers, if they see that you're running for the tram, like you're about to be late, some of them are nice and wait for you, but some of them I think get a little bit of enjoyment out of being like, oh, maybe next time, and going away. People there say it's like the 4th hardest language to learn, but I think everybody likes to think their language is pretty hard because they're kind of proud of it. And so the people are really understanding and really impressed when someone, especially someone who's native English speaker, learns Czech. But there's a letter in it. It's an R, and then it has a little, it's called a háček over it. It's like a little arrow over it. And it sounds like ž. So it's like rolling your R, but then a ž at the same time. So it gets really hard. I remember getting a little discouraged, and I'd try it over and over and over again, and then I'd get it one time and be like, oh, the gift of tongues, and then I couldn't do it again, so I'd have to keep practicing it. And then, of course, as in with a lot of languages, you have to conjugate verbs based on who's saying it or who's doing it, and then you also have to decline words based on whether they're the ones acting or being acted upon or to, or things like that. So it can be hard, but it's so fun. It's such a cool language. They have more verbs than English, that's for sure. Like they have a verb for calling someone, but the other person doesn't pick it up. You just call it so they have your number. And it's prozvolný. And ever since I've been back, I've been like, oh, I wish we had a word for that. We don't. So it's a really good language. You get all 4 seasons. The first winter I was there, it got really cold because I was in the northern part of the country. And sometimes, like, we wore coats that looked like sleeping bags because you gotta be comfortable, you know. And it snowed a bit. The second winter, it got cold, but snowed maybe once while I was there, and then the snow didn't really stick. The summers are hot, but it's not particularly humid or anything, so it's good weather. It's really beautiful in the fall too, because there are lots of trees there and everything looks really pretty. So in Prague, it's really beautiful because it's like cobblestone. They have the Prague Castle, which is famous there, and it's the thing that is really neat about Prague is that they have architecture and art there from all different eras. So the big deal about it is that during like World War II, it was never destroyed because Hitler wanted to make it his capital because it was such a beautiful city. So it never got destroyed like a lot of other Eastern European countries. And so it has lots of different styles of architecture there in the main part of the city. In the rest of it, there definitely are kind of ugly apartment buildings. They're just made out of cement, but they try and make them nicer by painting them fun colors. So that's kind of cool. So they used to be under communism for sure. And so there are some things about that they still kind of resent in some ways, and yet at the same time there's still like some of the traditions of communism, like being against religion and stuff like that, are still part of their general sentiment. I think they can't necessarily see that some of it is still affecting them in those ways, but they're also probably the most westernized of the Eastern countries, if that makes sense. They're one of the only countries that was under communism that has now become more successful economically since communism fell than they were before. Most of the other countries were much more powerful before and aren't doing as well now. And tourism has a lot to do with that. They're also really well known for their beer. So a lot of other people around Europe know that about them. And they love fairy tales. That is something that's really cool. It's kind of, Prague is like a little fairy tale city, but they love their fairy tales. They have like their own collection of Czech fairy tales. And everybody, they play them on TV, especially on Christmas Day, and everybody, even adults, sits down with their family and watches them. There's even a city that's known as like the City of Fairy Tales. And so that's something that's really cool.